Hi folks, welcome to the third installment in a series on getting your novel published. I'm Douglas Kruger. I'm the author of 12 commercially published business and self-help books, one novel that's hit the stands last year, and another one about to be released by Penguin. Today's topic, a very simple one. What do I actually do with my day? How do I go about the writing process? This is always completely subjective. I'll share with you what works for me. So how does my day go? Well, initially Jeeves draws the curtain and pours the scotch, and then the dancing girls arrive for the first number of the day. Now, in fact, what I tend to do is I tend to use two different systems together. The first is I simply capture my ideas on the fly using my phone. So, 2 videos ago, I spoke about how I get the idea for a novel. In quick recap, essentially, I picture a scene, a thing that happens, and I think, that's cool, someone should do something with that. Then I convince myself that I'm the person who has to do it, and what I do is I reverse engineer, and I say, how do I get to that scene? What would be required to set that up? And I might work backwards in time in order to arrive at the scene, or the scene might start a cascade of events. Either way, in my mind, it begins with a scene. Then what do I do? Well, I spend the next couple of days walking around the beach or on a treadmill at gym or whatever the case might be, mulling around with the idea. I don't usually take more than 2 or 3 days from conception of idea to starting to write the novel. And what I do in those 2 or 3 days is I literally write down bullet points on my phone. I capture them as I'm walking and dreaming, and I strongly recommend walking. It makes a big, big difference. And the thoughts that I capture on my phone are essentially about things that have to happen. So I'll give you a practical example of this. In the novel coming out soon called CharacterScan, which is a big, dark thriller in the style of something like a Dean Koontz, I have 2 major characters. The one is a rising antichrist who's coming to power globally, and the other is a young woman who is able to sense the intentions, the proclivity for evil in others. And what I do is I have to bring these two together over time. So what I then do in reverse engineering is I think to myself, all right, I have to show that this young woman has this ability. And I opened the novel with this idea that even before she was born, Katrina was able to sense the person around her. And that memories, real memories, were only supposed to start from 3 or 4, but even into adulthood, she could still remember a sense of this person around her to whom she was connected, a person full of warmth and love, and occasionally, great fear. So that sets up several things about what is about to happen in the novel. I then I show her at the age of 5 or 6, and a few childhood encounters where she can sense the intentions in other kids. I develop her into a teenager, and eventually I get to the point where she has realized that she can use this sense as a journalist, as a muckraker. She can go and find the darkness out there in the world. So I'm escalating her up to an encounter with this Antichrist figure. And what I did was I gave her 2 or 3 opponents in growing or escalating seriousness. So the first one was, she grows up in just outside of Dallas, Texas, and she comes across a corrupt politician who's got a penchant for children. And she's able to sense what this guy is like. And because of that, she's able to track him, follow him, and catch him out doing what he does. She then tries it at a national level. She discovers a politician operating on a much higher level who is deeply corrupt and brings this person down as well. And all of this is mounting up toward the encounter with the big one. So what I've done there, think about this in terms of notes on a phone. I've gone, I need these two to face off against each other. So where does she begin? I go back and I start her life and I grow this ability to do this thing until I lead up to the encounter between the two. So that's how I go about it. And I mentioned that I use 2 systems in conjunction. The first is the bullet point. The second one is working in waves. Now, still with the bullet points, what I will then tend to do after 2 or 3 days of dreaming and thinking about what needs to go where, I will then take all of these scattered bullet points. They're in no particular logical order. I'll transfer them to my Mac, and then I will start to look for a timeline. So I'll have something like, she must have a scene in which this happens. There must be a time in which, as a kid, that happens. And I go, all right, the kid one must come first. The other one must come later. And I take all my bullet points and try to put them loosely into a chronological order. What I then want to do is turn each major bullet point into an awesome scene. Books really are divisible into compelling scenes. So you take your bullet point and you say, a thing that has to happen. All right, how do I show this happening? I'm going to have her take down a pedophile. Right, so that's my scene. And then you go, all right, how do I add a couple of twists to this? And you write backwards, you go, let's get the audience thinking about this, thinking that this is the emotion driving that chapter. Then we'll switch it and we'll go there instead. Now I have an awesome scene on my hands. All I have to do is put in the slog work and actually write it. CharacterScan came out at about 105,000 words, just off the top of my head. So that's a compilation of different mechanical things that have to happen in this progression, then broken up into scenes that I then write one by one, putting as much emphasis as I can into making each scene something special. Now that matters to me. That's system number one. System number two, and this is really the practical day-to-day of how I write in waves. So you've heard the advice before that you don't have to write chronologically. You can write scenes completely out of order. I will occasionally do that, but not often, to be perfectly honest. The closest I get to that is if one of my pivotal scenes is the idea at the end. I've probably written quite a bit of that just to nail down how that's going to look and how it works. But I tend to start at the beginning and work my way along. I will then find, mechanically speaking, something that's happening here hinges on something that should have happened before, and I'll go back and insert a scene. So in that sense, I write out of sequence, but by and large, I start at the beginning and just follow the entire story. What I'll then do is I will write, say, chapter 1, and that might take me, say, 2 or 3 hours of a day. I will tend to sit and write for, say, 2 to 3 hours before I'm completely exhausted. Mechanically speaking, my typing speed, in high school, I took typing. At first I looked around and I was like, oh heck, I'm the only boy in typing class. And then it dawned on me, I'm the only boy in typing class. My typing speed was about 87 words a minute when I left, and I think it's increased since then. So I can touch type at more or less the same speed as I can think and narrate a story. If I work for, say, 2 or 3 hours, I can probably put down between 1,000 to 2,000 words. Not necessarily good words. I find that the more I get involved in visualizing what's happening, the more my spelling flies out the window. But it doesn't matter because you come back and you edit as you go. I try to think as deeply visually as I can. I like to get lost in picturing what's going on around this scene. And it's the emotions and the sense and all of the senses and so forth. So what I will then do is I will write for a couple of hours, and then either take a break and come back later that day, or perhaps come back the next day. And I write in waves, so I'll go back to the beginning of what I wrote, and I will read through it, making subtle edits, and then I will go beyond it. Then the next day I'll come back, say, halfway through that, read through it, making subtle edits, and go beyond it. And I find what happens there is by jumping into yesterday's writing, it spurs, it primes the pump, it gets the juices flowing, and it gets you back into the visualizing of the whole story. You start to live it again. You also pick up the subtle errors, but by the time you've worked your way to the end of that chapter, you're already you just pick up and keep going. You don't really think of it as, now I'm beginning to write. It's just, I'm already in the flow and on we go. So, in a very basic nutshell, that's what I try to do. I try to capture my ideas in bullet point form. They are a reverse engineering of a scene that I want to achieve, my big climax of the novel, or the big thing that I want to happen. I try to make each scene as compelling as I can, often by deceiving the reader. So if I know in a scene a thing is going to happen, I want to so distract the reader with the sense that something else is happening that they don't see it coming. And the extent to which you can do that well makes it interesting, makes it frightening, gives the reader that surprise effect. And it's actually not that hard to do. Let's just take an example. Let's say, for example, you are writing a horror story, and you've got something that bursts out of lakes and scares the living daylights out of people. Okay, so what you want to do is, say, grab a bunch of kids. Horror movies always have expendable kids. And let's say that they are at a camp somewhere, they're going down a slide. What you want to do is create a little human drama as a distraction. One of the kids is maybe, say a guy is interested in one of the girls, and it's his turn to go down the slide, but he's scared, and he's trying to show off for her, and there's another guy who's trying to get her attention, and you get the audience involved in the drama of that. And eventually something happens where this kid goes down the slide, and suddenly something is looking at him down in the deep. Now, you were so involved in the drama of the kids that you weren't expecting the face from the water. It's a cheap example, but that's the sort of thing that I mean. Whatever the emotional impact is, the thing that resonates, the major thing that happens in that chapter, find a way to distract your audience from it so that it becomes a surprise. You also get the sort of advice from James Patterson, people like that, end your chapters with the big climax. So it's distraction, 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 climax, end of chapter. Make them wait. Perhaps switch to some other characters and keep them waiting. And it's that art of veil and reveal that really becomes one of the tools at your disposal, and perhaps one of the best tools. So my process, very simply, big idea that pops into my head like a scene, reverse engineering of that idea, capturing of the notes in bullet point form, and then I turn the notes into the chapters. I try to make each chapter something a little special, and I try to make it set in an interesting place, do an interesting thing, have some movement in it, have some drama, perhaps introduce a red herring emotion so that the readers don't see where we're going. And then I just write the chapters one by one, writing in waves. And the actual process of getting the work done is write in a wave, review and write. So that's how I go about it. What's your process? Do you have something different? I'd love to hear from you down below. And if you have any questions that you might like to ask about things that I might tackle in the future, some of the background stuff of writing a novel, of getting published and so forth, please do have a look. Yesterday's video, or a couple of days ago, was about getting your novel published, how to approach publishers. And I will tackle pretty much anything that you want to know about the underlying mechanics of this trade. So drop me a comment below and ask whatever you want to do. And once you've done that, get back to writing, you wee scoundrel.